Consistency scares people, not because it is loud or aggressive or judgmental, but because it is quiet, predictable, and impossible to negotiate with. And when you show up every day without announcing it, without explaining it, without seeking praise, you become a living reminder of what discipline actually looks like. And that reminder creates discomfort in people who survive on excuses. Because consistency removes luck from the equation and exposes the uncomfortable truth that results are earned, not gifted. And most people are not afraid of effort, they are afraid of exposure, afraid of the moment they realize that their problems are not caused by bad timing or unfair circumstances, but by repeated choices they refuse to own. And when you stay consistent, you don't say this out loud. You don't need to. Your actions communicate it silently. And that silence is what unsettles people the most, because it leaves them alone with their own thoughts, their broken promises, their delayed goals, and their avoidance disguised as balance. And this is why consistency creates emotional tension in social environments, because human beings are wired to compare themselves to others, even when no competition exists. And when they see someone waking up early, training regularly, building quietly, and refusing to drift, they begin measuring their own habits against yours, not consciously, but instinctively. And when the gap becomes obvious, the mind looks for ways to reduce the discomfort, not by improving, but by rationalizing, minimizing, or distancing. And this is where the silent resistance begins. The jokes about doing too much, the comments about burning out, the advice about relaxing. Not because they care about your health, but because your discipline challenges the emotional comfort they built around inconsistency. And the silent samurai understood this dynamic centuries ago. The discipline is not just physical or mental, it is social. Because every consistent action disrupts the unspoken agreements people make with each other to remain comfortable, distracted, and unchanged. And when you break that agreement by staying consistent, even quietly, you become an outsider without trying to be one. And most people misinterpret this phase as loneliness or rejection, when in reality it is separation, a natural byproduct of alignment. Because consistency clarifies who is committed and who is merely interested. And this clarity creates distance, not because you are superior, but because you are no longer participating in the same emotional economy, the economy of excuses, complaints, and delayed action. And this is where many people make the mistake of shrinking themselves to fit back in, softening routines, skipping days, explaining discipline, and trading progress for approval, because social belonging feels safer than solitude. But the silent samurai never adjusted his discipline to make others comfortable, because he understood that consistency is not about motivation, it is about identity. About becoming someone who shows up regardless of mood, validation, or support. And when you reach that level, people don't know how to place you anymore, because you don't complain, you don't seek reassurance, and you don't ask permission. And that absence of emotional negotiation feels threatening to those who rely on external validation to regulate their self-worth. And this is why consistency often attracts quiet resentment rather than open admiration. Because admiration requires humility, and resentment allows people to preserve their ego while avoiding responsibility. And they don't hate you, they hate the mirror you represent, the mirror that reflects discipline they postponed, comfort they chose, and potential they ignored. And the silent samurai never argued with this resistance, never defended his routine, never explained his path, because he knew that consistency doesn't need to be understood to be effective. It only needs to be maintained. And this is the first lesson most people never learn, that consistency is not meant to impress, it is meant to compound. And compounding requires patience, emotional independence, and the willingness to walk alone while others watch from a distance, judging quietly, hoping you stop so they don't have to face themselves. And if you can survive this phase without retreating, without performing, without apologizing for your discipline, you begin to cross into a different category of individual, one who no longer depends on motivation or approval to continue. And at that point, consistency stops being something you do and becomes something you are.
And that is when the fear it creates in others becomes irrelevant, because your focus shifts inward toward progress, alignment, and mastery, rather than outward toward reactions you can't control anyway. Consistency continues to scare people because over time it becomes undeniable, and denial is the last defense of an undisciplined mind. Because at first, people can dismiss effort as temporary, assume you'll quit, wait for enthusiasm to fade, and tell themselves this is just a phase. But when weeks turn into months, and months turn into years, consistency becomes proof, and proof demands accountability. And accountability is what most people spend their lives avoiding. And at this stage, the discomfort deepens, because now your discipline isn't just visible, it's permanent. And permanence removes hope that you'll return to familiar ground. And when people realize you're not coming back to the same habits, conversations, or lifestyle, they begin to emotionally distance themselves, not out of hatred, but out of self-preservation, because your presence reminds them of paths they chose not to walk. And the silent samurai recognized this moment as a test, not of strength, but of loyalty to one's own standards, because this is where discipline demands sacrifice, not just of time or energy, but of social comfort, approval, and familiarity. And most people fail here by trying to make discipline palatable, explaining routines, justifying goals, and reassuring others that they're still the same. But consistency cannot be softened without being weakened. And the more you explain, the more you invite negotiation, and the more you negotiate, the more you dilute your identity. And the silent samurai never negotiated with his training, because he understood that discipline explained is discipline compromised. And instead of responding to resistance, he reduced exposure, shared less, spoke less, and allowed time to do what words never could. Because time rewards consistency and exposes pretense. And slowly, something shifts. The same people who felt uncomfortable begin to adjust. Some disappear completely, some observe silently, and a few begin to respect you. Not because you convinced them, but because consistency has a way of teaching without instruction. And this is why discipline eventually earns quiet respect, even from those who once minimized it. Because human beings instinctively recognize reliability, and reliability signals safety, competence, and trustworthiness. But this respect only arrives if you remain consistent without resentment, without superiority, and without bitterness. Because bitterness reveals dependence on approval, while neutrality reveals independence. And the silent samurai remained neutral, unaffected by praise or criticism, because both are distractions if they influence behavior. And at this level, consistency becomes freedom. Freedom from emotional swings, freedom from external validation, and freedom from the need to belong to spaces that no longer align. And most people misunderstand this freedom as coldness or isolation, but it is neither. It is self-respect expressed through behavior rather than words. And once you embody this, your discipline no longer scares people in the same way, because the fear was never about you. It was about what your consistency forced them to see in themselves. And when that realization fades into acceptance, the resistance dissolves, leaving only distance or respect. And both outcomes are healthy, because consistency was never meant to keep everyone close. It was meant to keep you aligned. And this is the final lesson of the silent samurai, that consistency is not a tool for success alone. It is a filter. Filtering environments, relationships, and identities until only what supports your growth remains. And if you can accept that some people will fall away, not because you failed them, but because you refuse to fail yourself, then consistency stops being heavy, stops being lonely, and becomes light, automatic, and inevitable. And at that point, you no longer care who is scared by your discipline, because your focus is no longer on reactions, but on the quiet satisfaction of becoming someone you can rely on, every day, without exception.
Silence is the final test of strength because it removes the last thing most people rely on to feel safe, the ability to explain themselves, defend their choices, justify their behavior, and correct how others perceive them. And when that ability is taken away voluntarily, the ego panics because the ego survives through reaction, recognition, and response, and silence denies all three at once. And this is why most people can work hard, train their bodies, wake up early, and even stay disciplined for a while, but collapse emotionally the moment they feel misunderstood, ignored, or misjudged, because silence forces you to sit with the discomfort of not being seen the way you want to be seen. And the silent samurai understood this deeply, that words are often a shield for insecurity, not a sign of intelligence, and the louder a person feels the need to explain, the more fragile their internal foundation usually is, because true strength does not need to be narrated, it does not rush to clarify, and it does not fear misinterpretation. And when you begin walking the disciplined path, silence becomes unavoidable, because fewer people understand what you're doing, fewer conversations feel meaningful, and fewer reactions feel necessary. And this is where the test begins, because the mind starts whispering that silence means isolation, that quiet means rejection, that not responding means losing control. And most people fail here by talking themselves back into noise, oversharing, defending decisions, explaining routines, softening boundaries, and diluting discipline just to feel emotionally connected again. But the silent samurai never filled silence with words. He filled it with presence, observation, and restraint, because he knew that silence reveals whether your confidence is internal or borrowed, and borrowed confidence requires constant validation, while internal confidence can exist without witnesses. And this is why silence terrifies people who are still dependent on external feedback, because without reaction, they don't know who they are, and without explanation, they feel invisible, and invisibility feels like danger to the ego. But in reality, invisibility is where power consolidates, because when no one is watching closely, you are free to become something real. And silence also removes social armor, the jokes, the opinions, the emotional expressions people use to signal belonging. And when you stop participating in that exchange, others feel unsettled, not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped mirroring them. And human beings rely heavily on mirroring for comfort, and when that disappears, insecurity surfaces, projection begins, and silence is blamed, interpreted as arrogance, coldness, or distance. And most people react to these projections defensively, trying to correct the narrative. But the silent samurai never corrected perception, because perception is not something you control through words, it is something you influence through consistency over time. And this is where silence becomes the hardest discipline of all, because it requires patience without reassurance, restraint without reward, and calm without confirmation. And it forces you to confront the question most people avoid their entire lives. If no one claps, approves, or understands, will you still continue? And this is why silence is the final test, because it strips away performance and leaves only intention. And those who pass this test stop needing to prove anything. They stop reacting to misinterpretation, and they stop fearing judgment, because they realize that strength does not require consensus, and clarity does not require explanation. And once you understand this, silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling solid, like standing on firm ground while noise collapses around you. Silence builds unbreakable authority because over time it teaches others how to treat you without you having to instruct them, argue with them, or demand respect. And this happens not through intimidation, but through consistency, because silence paired with aligned action creates a psychological weight that words never can. And at first, people test it, filling the quiet with assumptions, projections, and subtle provocations, hoping to pull a reaction out of you, because reaction gives them leverage, clarity, and emotional access. But when no reaction comes, when silence remains calm and steady, something shifts. Confusion replaces confidence, and uncertainty replaces control. Because people are used to negotiating behavior through emotion, and silence removes negotiation entirely. And the silent samurai allowed this process to unfold naturally, never rushing to re-engage, never explaining his restraint, and never justifying his distance, because he understood that authority is not declared, it is observed. And silence gives people space to observe your consistency without distraction. And over time, the same silence that once triggered discomfort begins to command respect, not because you demanded it, but because reliability signals strength, and strength signals safety. And this is why silence eventually attracts a different quality of interaction. Fewer words, more intention. Fewer tests, more trust, because people subconsciously recognize that emotional manipulation no longer works and that presence must replace pressure. And this transformation only occurs if silence is maintained without bitterness, without superiority, and without resentment, because resentment leaks need, and need weakens silence. But neutral silence, silence without emotional charge, becomes untouchable. And at this level, you stop monitoring how you are perceived, because perception is unstable and temporary, while character is stable and cumulative. And the silent samurai focused only on character, on alignment between values and behavior, because alignment creates coherence, and coherence creates authority. And authority does not require volume, it requires integrity. And this is why silence eventually feels light, because you stop carrying the burden of being understood, and that freedom unlocks a deeper calm, one that cannot be shaken by criticism or praise, because both lose their influence. And this shift changes how you move through the world. Slower speech, fewer words, clearer decisions, and sharper awareness. And people sense this shift immediately, even if they can't explain it, because calm presence is felt before it is analyzed. And this is the completion of the silent samurai path, where discipline no longer feels heavy, consistency no longer feels isolating, and silence no longer feels threatening, because you are no longer waiting for permission to be yourself. And the final realization arrives quietly, that silence was never about withdrawing from the world. It was about withdrawing from noise, from unnecessary reactions, from borrowed opinions, and from emotional dependency. And once that withdrawal is complete, you don't disappear, you stabilize. And stability is what most people unconsciously seek, admire, and follow. Because in a world addicted to noise, the quietest presence often holds the most power. And those who can remain silent without shrinking, without explaining, and without disengaging from their values have already passed the final test, because silence did not weaken them, it revealed who they were all along.
The moment you stop needing people the way you once did, something subtle but undeniable begins to shift in your environment. Because need was never just emotional, it was structural. It was the invisible glue that held certain relationships together. And when that glue dissolves, the structure weakens. And many people mistake this collapse for betrayal, when in reality it is exposure. Because what you are witnessing is not people turning against you, but people losing leverage. And leverage is what many relationships quietly run on. Not connection, not loyalty, not even affection, but emotional access and psychological dependency. And when you become self-respecting, internally anchored, and no longer available for regulation, that access closes. And those who benefited from it feel destabilized, not because you changed into something worse, but because you changed into something independent. And independence removes utility. And when utility disappears, resentment often replaces affection. And this is why self-respect carries a social cost that few talk about.
Because as long as you are accommodating, explainable, predictable, and emotionally available on demand, you are easy to integrate, easy to influence, and easy to keep comfortable. But once you stop over-explaining, stop chasing validation, stop softening your boundaries, and stop performing emotional labor for others, the system around you recalibrates, and those who relied on your reactions feel the loss immediately, because you are no longer stabilizing their insecurities, their identity, or their sense of control. And this loss triggers quiet hostility, not always loud confrontation, but subtle withdrawal, misinterpretation, passive aggression, and narrative shifts. Because people rarely say they miss your need, they say you changed. And this accusation is not a moral judgment, it is a grief response, because the version of you that made them feel secure is gone, and the new version no longer negotiates identity through approval. And this is where many people break their own self-respect, rushing to reassure, to explain their growth, to soften their edges, and to make themselves smaller again just to restore harmony. But harmony built on dependency is not peace, it is containment. And the disciplined individual learns to sit through this phase without collapsing back into old patterns, understanding that distance is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is the natural outcome of self-alignment. And the samurai understood that when you stand upright internally, you become harder to lean on, and those who leaned too heavily will stumble, and rather than blaming gravity, they blame the pillar. And this is the phase where self-respect is tested, not through hardship, but through social friction, because nothing reveals the true foundation of relationships faster than your refusal to overextend yourself. And as you hold this line, the environment begins to show you who was connected to your essence and who was attached to your availability. And this distinction, once seen, cannot be unseen, because you realize that much of what felt like loyalty was actually access, and much of what felt like support was actually regulation. And when that ends, the turning begins, not because you became cold, but because you stopped being useful in the way they needed. And this is the unspoken price of self-respect, that clarity replaces comfort, and silence replaces negotiation, and standing alone becomes easier than bending again. What most people don't expect is that once the turning begins, it doesn't come with explosions or dramatic endings. It comes quietly, through absence, through changed tone, through conversations that feel slightly off. Because people rarely confront what they cannot control. They retreat, reframe, and rationalize. And the disciplined individual notices this not with bitterness, but with precision, understanding that social ecosystems self-correct, and when you remove yourself as an emotional resource, others must adapt, and adaptation often feels like rejection before it feels like growth. And this is where the difference between ego and self-respect becomes clear, because ego demands acknowledgement, explanation, and closure, while self-respect accepts reality without forcing interpretation. And the samurai never chased closure, because closure is often just another attempt to regain influence. And instead, he observed who adjusted with respect and who withdrew with resentment. And this observation revealed a deeper truth, that healthy connections evolve when need dissolves, while unhealthy ones collapse. And this collapse is not a failure, it is filtration. And filtration is painful only if you are attached to outcomes rather than alignment. And as this filtration completes, something unexpected happens. The emotional noise decreases, the internal clarity sharpens, and a new standard forms, not because you demanded better treatment, but because you stopped tolerating less. And people respond to standards even when they resist them. And over time, the same individuals who quietly turned away either return with a different posture or remain distant permanently. And both outcomes are acceptable, because self-respect is not a negotiation, it is a position. And this position attracts fewer people but higher integrity, fewer conversations but deeper presence, and fewer reactions but stronger boundaries. And this is why self-respect eventually feels peaceful, not lonely, because loneliness comes from abandonment of self, not from separation from others. And the samurai learned that being misunderstood is lighter than being misaligned, and being alone is safer than being consumed. And when you stop needing people to validate your direction, your pace, or your discipline, you gain something far more stable: internal authority. And authority does not beg, explain, or chase. It stands. And those who recognize it approach with respect, while those who depended on your need fade into distance. And this distance is not punishment, it is resolution. Because relationships built on dependency cannot survive self-respect, and relationships built on respect do not require need. And once you fully understand this, the turning no longer hurts, it clarifies, because you realize they didn't turn on you, they simply couldn't follow you where you went, and you no longer needed them to.
After the turning has happened and the distance has settled, a quieter phase begins, one that few people talk about because it lacks drama but carries the most weight. The phase where you stop scanning the room for reactions, stop measuring your growth against who stayed or left, and stop interpreting silence as loss. Because by now, your nervous system has recalibrated, and what once felt like rejection now feels like space. And space allows observation, and observation reveals patterns that were invisible when you were emotionally involved. And this is where you begin to notice how much energy you used to spend managing other people's comfort, smoothing tensions that were never yours, explaining decisions that didn't require permission, and adjusting your pace to avoid making others feel left behind. And once that energy returns to you, something stabilizes internally, a sense of forward gravity, where movement feels natural rather than forced. And the samurai recognized this phase as the return of center, because when you are no longer pulled by approval or resistance, your actions align effortlessly with your values. And this alignment creates consistency without struggle, because you are no longer splitting attention between self-direction and social maintenance. And the people who remain in your orbit during this phase behave differently. They don't question your boundaries. They don't demand access. They don't require constant reassurance, because respect has replaced dependency. And respect does not need maintenance. It only needs consistency. And this shift feels subtle but profound, because conversations become cleaner, expectations become clearer, and emotional exchanges lose their volatility. And at the same time, you begin to notice the absence of those who thrived on reaction. And this absence no longer creates doubt, because clarity has replaced confusion, and clarity removes the impulse to chase. And the most dangerous mistake here is mistaking this calm for stagnation and attempting to reintroduce noise just to feel movement. But the disciplined individual understands that silence is not emptiness, it is compression, and compression precedes force. And this is where internal authority matures, because you are no longer proving independence, you are living it, and living it quietly is what separates temporary detachment from permanent self-respect. Because true self-respect does not announce itself, it is felt through consistency, through predictability of principles, and through the absence of emotional bargaining. And when you reach this phase, even conflict changes, because you no longer argue to win, you disengage to protect alignment. And disengagement is not avoidance, it is selection, and selection is power. Because you cannot be pulled into dynamics you no longer feed. And this is why the samurai did not fear being alone, because solitude sharpened awareness, and awareness sharpened judgment, and judgment protected direction. And at this stage, direction becomes non-negotiable, not because you are rigid, but because you are clear. And clarity does not bend to accommodate confusion. Eventually, you arrive at the final realization, one that reframes the entire journey, that self-respect was never about distancing from people, it was about removing internal dependency. And once dependency dissolves, relationships reorder themselves naturally, without confrontation, without declarations, without emotional reckoning. And this is where peace becomes durable rather than temporary,
because it no longer depends on how others behave, respond, or interpret you. And this independence creates a quiet authority that people sense before they understand, because humans instinctively respond to those who are not seeking extraction, approval, or validation. And this is why over time, new connections form with less friction and more mutual respect, because you are no longer advertising emotional availability as a currency. You are offering presence selectively. And presence given freely is far more powerful than presence given out of need. And at this point, even criticism loses its edge, because criticism relies on leverage, and leverage disappears when identity is internally sourced. And the samurai knew that when no one can move you emotionally, no one can control you strategically. And this freedom does not make you cold, it makes you precise, because compassion without self-respect leads to depletion, while self-respect without compassion leads to isolation. And the balance emerges naturally once dependency is removed, and what remains is grounded engagement, where you give without draining and receive without clinging. And this balance attracts fewer people but stronger bonds, fewer interactions but deeper meaning. And this is why the turning was necessary, because it removed relationships that required you to stay small, reactive, and explainable, and in their place created room for alignment. And alignment compounds quietly, because you are no longer leaking energy through emotional management. And this reclaimed energy shows up as patience, discipline, and calm confidence. And people mistake this calm for detachment, when in reality it is integration. And once integrated, you stop fearing loss, because nothing essential can be taken from someone who is internally anchored. And the final irony is that those who once turned away sometimes reappear later, not to reclaim closeness, but to test whether access is still available. And the disciplined individual responds not with resentment or invitation, but with neutrality, because neutrality reveals intent faster than confrontation ever could. And by now you understand that you don't need to punish anyone for leaving, because their absence already served its purpose. And the journey ends not with triumph, but with quiet stability, the kind that doesn't need witnesses, because the samurai never measured success by who followed him, only by whether he remained aligned with himself. And once alignment is permanent, nothing external can turn against you again, because you are no longer leaning on anything that can move.